Thank you, Maria. This was powerful. Well, I think if those of us who are old enough would go back 20, 25 years to our youthful enthusiasm, we would have liked to celebrate the utopia of free speech in the digital realm today on this stage. Now, this hour feels like a drum roll to a very dramatic epiphany that is very painful. So, you just mentioned what you described might be our future, and we here in Europe, especially in Germany, we still feel very safe because we live in so-called stable democracies. Maybe a quick reminder, our democratic state of unified Germany is 3 years younger than post-Marcos Philippines. So what makes you say this could be our future?
We've seen it happen in different countries around the world, and Brexit being the other one. I know that the same tactics, the same strategic goals, which is essentially to make people in a democracy doubt the facts. Without the facts, you can't do anything, right? Your democracy crumbles from within. The facts are there. The research shows it. It's very clear. It's hard to be in denial. Germany is a step ahead because I think, and this is where the solution can move, right? Post-World War II, the whole world came together. And it wasn't just what happened in Germany, it was what happened with the atom bomb. It was the whole world came together to try to protect humanity from the worst of what humanity can do. And after that, we had all those agreements, NATO, Bretton Woods, the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Well, this is another one of those moments, and the game changer is tech, right? An atom bomb exploded in the information ecosystem, and we need to come together because the solution isn't in one country alone. My problems were caused by decisions in Silicon Valley first. That's the fertilizer, and the rest of it follows.
But isn't tech in itself neutral?
No, tech is not neutral. I mean, it's how it's used. And through time now, we have seen that the people, strangely, American social media platforms who espouse the most liberal of values are the ones who are bringing draconian leaders in and helping put them in place, right? You can look at it as, actually, I'm going to quote Chris Wiley again because he said, colonialism never died, it just moved online. So we have the first layer of colonialism, which is the American social media platforms. Then the second layer on top of that are companies like Cambridge Analytica. And here's the part that's difficult. It's not just Cambridge Analytica. We talk like there's only one of them. They're coming from the Philippines now, right? The only person that's been named in a Facebook takedown, is a digital advertising executive. His name is Nick Gabonada, and he is from the Philippines. Facebook specifically named him.
Right. So, do these social media attack specific vulnerabilities? For example, what were those vulnerabilities in the Philippines, and do you see any of those in Germany?
Oh, so interesting. Yes, the vulnerabilities in the Philippines. Think about it like this: those decisions in Silicon Valley leave the worst trails in the global south, where our democracies are just emerging, where in the Philippines we had endemic corruption, weak institutions, and weak law enforcement. When you poison the information ecosystem on top of that, you elect someone like Duterte, who was elected because there were a field of 5 different candidates. So he was elected just by a small margin. It wasn't a majority vote. And now he is changing us, dismantling, and we're walking into another dictatorship. Corruption is the root core in the Philippines. That's why you can see everyone being charged with corruption. In the United States, it's identity. It is racial identity. Look at what happened with Black Lives Matter. In Germany, you have a resurgence, right? Globally, we have a resurgence of alt-right in a way that we have never seen before, when the gatekeepers were journalists held accountable for what we allowed into the public sphere.
Peter, you, as a co-founder of Pirate Bay, were somebody who had a utopian vision that was very democratic, and then it exploded globally, and you also became a a politician, so you have a great experience with these dynamics. Is there a point where you lose control over an innovation like Pirate Bay and becomes something that you cannot control anymore?
Well, with Pirate Bay, that was kind of the idea, that we wanted to have something which we didn't control, because I think, at least I believed in this idea that the internet was for everyone, and it was an open space, only good could come out of it. Later, I've started realizing that this uncontrolled things means that it's controlled by someone who owns the infrastructure. So I think what I've seen is that the technicians like me that grew up with the internet have been super naive, and we've become kind of not elected. We elected ourselves to control democracy without thinking that we have this responsibility. And I think that's basically my feeling still, that we have this narrative of the internet being a democratic institution, even though it's never really been. It's just a narrative. When you speak to technicians about that, they would hold up Obama as an example of what social media can bring, but in reality it's Trump, at least this reality. Because the alt-right has been really, and I would say capitalism has been fueling this by understanding that they can make money from these platforms. They don't really have the same ethical standards as I think most of the users have, because ethics was never part of the protocol. Right? So when I'm at conferences speaking about technology, I go often to technology conferences and I always speak about ethics and morality and ideology and philosophy. Because that's the missing link in technologist education, because we're building something which maybe we shouldn't have power over. It should be something which other people have power over, democratic power.
And why do you think, maybe that's also a question for all three of you, why do you think that digital technology tends to amplify dystopia, even though the original idea was utopia? Even in your case, I mean, why is it that the negative forces, like why does alt-right, something that was on the margins of society, especially in America, why does this get so much power?
I think that's your view of it, because I think that what I see as dystopia is utopia for someone else. So I think maybe it's a privileged view of saying this is utopia or this is dystopia.
Anger and hate spreads faster. That's just a reality.
Why is that?
All the data points that way. I mean, look at us. We'll spread gossip that's salacious. It spreads, but when it's not amplified, it stays, right? When you get angry, that's when you share. And I think we have, before Facebook came out with all of the emojis, we had mood meter. That was one of the things in Rappler. And we could see anger spreads fastest. But here's the other part. The emotion that spreads second fastest is inspiration. That's also incredible. So I'm trying to figure out what can we do with that? But in general, it's people who want a scorched earth policy that is taking control and manipulating. I want to hear what you think.
Well, you did great research at MIT about fake news is a big part of this negative digital realm, how fake news travels or false news travels, and why is it faster than truth?
Well, I mean, I think this is a really interesting topic. So the study that we did was, at the time it was published, the largest longitudinal study of the spread of false news online. We worked directly with Twitter and had access to the entire Twitter historical archive. So we had access to all of the tweets that were ever tweeted for 10 years, except for the ones that were deleted. And what we found in studying this was that false news traveled farther, faster, deeper, and more broadly than the truth in every category of information that we studied, sometimes by an order of magnitude. And false political news was the most viral type of false news. And in this very large data set, we confirmed that false news was inspiring anger and was inspiring surprise. So what we discovered was that shock value, novelty, was something that really inspires viral spread. And false news has a big advantage on the truth in terms of novelty because it's just made up. There's a much larger space of falsity to be novel than the truth. The truth is constrained by a reality that we can all touch and feel and believe in. But when you study misinformation, and I have a book coming out in September called The Hype Machine, which is about how social media works to disrupt democracy and the truth and so on, and to really study it. I actually started studying social media in the year 2000. So it's a 20-year endeavor for me now. And this book reports all of that study that you're talking about was on the cover of Science, but we've been doing this for 20 years, studying data like yours, but at the scale of a Twitter or a Facebook. And so that book opens with the story of the annexation of Crimea, and not sort of popular accounts of it, but actually digging into the Twitter data. And I want to touch on something that you said, which was very poignant, which is that two things. One, this notion of repetition creates belief. That's been proven true in many studies. So repeating false news creates a belief in false news. And this other one is the mixing of truth and falsity, what we in our study called mixed news. Right. And this mixed news is particularly insidious because it is cloaking falsity in sort of an aura of truth. Mm-hmm. And when I can see something, part of which I can verify, right, then I start to believe the entire story, and that's where I can slip falsity in. And in fact, if you look at the data around the annexation of Crimea, and as my book opens to tell this story, across 10 years of Twitter data, there was one spike in mixed news that was 4 times greater than at any other point in the 10 years of Twitter's history. And that was during the 2 months of the annexation of Crimea, and it ended just as quickly as it began. Yeah. That story and how that thing actually worked is a fascinating understanding of how sophisticated this type of misinformation campaign is, and it's this really intriguing symbiosis of bots and humans working together to spread misinformation.
Why do you think that misinformation travels much faster in the political and the digital realm? I mean, did you encounter this phenomenon yourself?
Well, obviously it's more interesting. I think most of us are just after the entertainment of it. Like it's a human thing to be after entertainment, and as Maria was talking about, the gossip is really interesting to people. And obviously, I also go for this information because it is entertaining, and I also want to feel like I also worked with WikiLeaks for quite a long while, and very often we also felt internally that some of when we could find stories that were a little bit truth, maybe there's truth to the other stories that people reported. So it's really hard to find the boundary. As well.
And in a wide open realm like the digital world, is there even a space for gatekeepers anymore? For people who are like...
I think so, right? And part of the biggest problem right now is that the gatekeepers refuse to act like gatekeepers. You know, the only way you can have an open market system is with rules. And the rules that are there aren't good enough. They don't have the sophistication. But, you know, when you ask the difference, before I started doing this, the reason we set up Rappler was my first 2 books is about looking at terrorism and how the ideology of terrorism spreads. In the real world, you look at them, they spread through social networks, family and friends. What's social media? It's your social network without boundaries of time and space. So the second book I wrote is about how it spread to social media. It's called From Bin Laden to Facebook. Rappler was set up on these principles, that if an ideology that is extremely vicious can spread, well, why can't the good guys use those same ideas to actually do good things? And we did, up until the social media platforms changed the rules of the game. And think about it like this. This is a moving target. It's like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, right? You will never find exactly where it is because they're constantly changing the code, right? It's constantly, every 2 weeks, they're replenishing it. So we feel the impact of what they did 2 years ago, 2 years later. But by the time we figure out what it is, it's already moved on. That's what the Heisenberg uncertainty principle is. To find the location of an electron in a closed system, you take a radioactive electron and shoot it into the system, and then it gets deflected. But the very act of looking for it moves it somewhere else. That's kind of where we are today, I think.
And what were these accelerators, I mean, that you just described, when they changed it? What accelerated those negative dynamics again and again and again?
In Facebook's case, and Ari, maybe you want to talk about it, but in Facebook's case, I think it was they're wanting to chase Twitter through news, and then definitely in 2015, instant articles, when it welcomed all the news groups into the ecosystem without changing the algorithms, right? It is a behavioral modification system, and we are like Pavlov's dogs walking into it. Sorry, I shouldn't have said it like that.
Well, it's true. I mean, if you, for instance, if you go back to, first of all, the book that I've written, the third chapter is about your brain on social media. How does it work with our dopamine system? How does it work with the mentalizing network?
Yeah.
How does it work to sort of engage our brains through, stimulation of salacious facts and so on? But if you go back to Sean Parker, when he talks about the founding of Facebook, he admits it very readily, that the dopamine response is something that they explicitly thought about in designing Facebook and creating the notion of likes and so on. Now, what you're seeing, it's actually a very complicated topic, because what you're seeing now is last year approximately, Mark Zuckerberg announced at F8 that Facebook would be going private. Right? So now we're going to have private groups and everything's going to be sort of secretive and so on. As if that somehow solves the problem, it actually makes it more difficult to deal with. But at the same time, it's very difficult to understand how to force a private entity to regulate the speech on its platform without norms, without ethics, and without morality. Because in the United States, we have a lot of people saying, oh, well, regulation. Let's give the power to the government to regulate speech. But people who are in the Philippines know that that's not where you want to put the power to decide on who gets to say what on social media. That's exactly the wrong place to put the power. So then the question becomes, how do you incentivize the platforms to take a more active role in cleaning up their ecosystems? And there's been this debate. In the United States, we have something called the Communications Decency Act, which regulates companies like Facebook and Twitter. And there's a specific section called Section 230, which people misinterpret. That section says, ostensibly, that platforms are sort of absolved of responsibility of the content that users post to their platforms. And people think that that gives them free rein to allow any kind of false news and hate speech to slosh around on their platforms. In fact, Section 230 was designed for exactly the opposite reason, because they would be sued if they were responsible for their content, and they wouldn't moderate if they could be sued. Section 230 was actually designed to get platforms to moderate their content. So now people are asking for the repeal of Section 230, which is really kind of an ironic twist about the actual, provenance of that section of the law. This is not an easy concept. There are a lot of nuances, and I think people searching for silver bullets are going to be looking for a long time.
Well, the law would be one way. On the other hand, don't companies realize that a faulty product cuts down their longevity? So, for example, it seems like in Silicon Valley, the addictive nature of certain digital technology seems to seep in, and they start to change it, and they build in these breaks. Why not in social media, and why not in the political realm?
I think the big problem is that they don't have to adopt at all, because we have to adopt to them. So when you look at social media, we have to go with the rules that Facebook's imply, and they can just move their company to somewhere where they basically can put them in an offshore country somewhere and dictate the terms of legislation just as well as jurisdiction, right? So I think we're beyond the point where companies have to adopt to the users. We have no choice anymore. So I don't, maybe you don't agree with this, but
well, I mean, I don't know if you've been watching, but Facebook is just printing money. I mean, they have had a horrible last 2 years, but you wouldn't notice that in their stock price. Okay, so I think what you just said is the starting point of the cleanup, which is we have no choice. There is no competition. And competition is the centerpiece for creating an incentive for platforms to make better products. If they don't have to compete, then they can just focus on profit. If they have to compete, then they have to deliver consumer value in order to keep their consumers. So you can't have a solution to this problem without injecting competition into the social media marketplace.
So a year ago, I would have agreed that enlightened self-interest could have worked. And I literally, Rappler is one of 2 Filipino fact-checking partners of Facebook. We're still partners, and part of the reason we do that is when you check the content, you know when a lie is a lie. Then we look at the network that spreads the lies, right? The Philippines without Facebook could also be different. I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's still really good things, and let me defend Facebook while I've been ragging on them for a while. In a country like the Philippines, again, these weak democracies, Facebook, in countries where human rights are at risk, Facebook gives people a chance to fight back. It's asymmetrical warfare. That's the way it was set up, right? But then the way they tweaked it for money to bring in more people pushed it too far over. And so I'm still hoping that the people inside these American companies realize the effect that they have had, and maybe with Americans pushing them, with the American government, with your elections coming up, maybe not yours, the US elections coming up, that there could be significant change. But you notice they will happen first in the US, then in Europe, and then maybe in our part of the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, you work with Twitter. Twitter seems to be willing to change much more openly now than Facebook, probably because it became the bully pulpit of Trump in their own home country. How real is their will to change, and how feasible is it that this change will then translate into the real world?
Well, I mean, I have to say that, Jack Dorsey has been very publicly committed to this notion of communication health. Mm-hmm. He was personally very supportive of our study, despite the fact that the results could create negative press for Twitter. He could have very easily shut it down, but he did not do that. And in fact, through several rounds of conversation, he continued to be very supportive of the sort of public nature of the study. But at the same time, Twitter is potentially even less cleaned up than Facebook, because there's no insistence on, on a real ID in Twitter. There's way more fake accounts and bots on Twitter because it's kind of more of a free-for-all. And so it's not clear, that it's murky in every direction. No matter where you push on it, you notice bright spots, and you also notice sort of challenges at the same time.
Twitter is better than Facebook in my part of the world, and that's partly because, and you can see this, they've taken the lead, for example, in what's happening in Hong Kong in Chinese disinformation. They have a group that is specifically focused on that. I'm a bit more protected on Twitter than I am on Facebook, even though Facebook is trying to do its best. But its best, under these present circumstances, I don't think is good enough, and we've told them that. I think here's the last part of how we think about these people and how they think of themselves, right? Brittany Kaiser, who I think is here, but she wrote a book and it's outside, right? Talks about how easily you can move from one value system to another. It is the rationalization of, because I think about how can my good friends in Facebook allow this to happen? It's because they've rationalized it and they've moved the line. And yes, there are incentives of power and money there, but I hope with your help, I hope they realize they are destroying the medium term and their future. And I go back still to enlightened self-interest, right? This year, I go back to this. If we don't change things fundamentally this year, I could go to jail in the Philippines. Where the United States goes, I think the rest of the world will go.
Well, is one of the problems, I ask you, because you also, as a member of the Pirate Party, you kind of worked in analog politics as well. Isn't the power of capital a problem that will always be, because that will always be stronger than ethics, than political will? I mean, should we get them all off the public market again?
I think it's, to begin with, I ran for office because I was wanted by Interpol, and if I won, I would get diplomatic immunity. That was also my campaign.
That's very pragmatic.
Very pragmatic. I'm a pragmatic person. But I think that the big problem is that we're trying to have everything is mixed in one bowl. So we have capitalism, we have your identity, we have infrastructure, we have democracy. It's just one bowl. And I think we need to split it up. I think that infrastructure is today owned by very few companies. Like I talk about the ownership of fiber cables, IP addresses, domain names, everything is controlled by very few companies. They're all based in the United States. I'm not saying that it's a problem just because it's US, but it's based in one country, where vetoes come from the government. So the Trade Department of the United States can veto every single decision made over the internet, even though it's in another part of the world. This is a problem for democracy's foundation. And because of this centralization, I think we also get the capitalism becoming the big problem, because there is private identities and user data that we can capitalize from. And if we took out the ownership of the data, so that we as individuals owned our own data, and we decided what to do with it, and just look at, for instance, your Google account. If you pay Google the amount of money that they make from ads by your account, I think it's like $1 or $2 per year they actually make from your data. I would gladly pay $1 or $2 per year to not have Google sniff my data. And that would be an option for me, and it would also maybe be a better option for Google to make money from, to sell these services, if the law was and regulation was made that way. So I would say that we've been super naive by allowing very few companies that also start buying each other. So like we have these monoliths that are basically monopolies. Like we have Uber, we have Airbnb, we have Facebook, we have Twitter. It's one in each category. And that's because we didn't do our groundwork right. So the time is to split that up so that we own our own data, we make sure that communities own their own infrastructure, and that we can move between different providers of data handling.
Let's be super optimistic for a moment. If you say a lie is the ultimate free speech, because I'm allowed to tell a lie, how can people who want to tell the truth and who want to tell a positive truth reclaim that value of free speech? And wouldn't America be the place to be? I mean, the free speech is the First Amendment in their constitution. Do you think there are methods or ways to reclaim that value of this free speech back from the untruths?
The way the information ecosystem is set up today, the way the algorithms are set up today. And it's not just, we talked about Facebook, but YouTube, right? That's also been documented, that in order to keep you scrolling, you are just fed more and more radical content, right? So the way these information ecosystems have been set up is, no, you don't have free will, right? What it actually spreads are the worst of the worst. It spreads half-lies, fastest and further. Roger Cohen can actually, he said it, right? You have the freedom of speech, but you shouldn't have freedom of reach. So I'm not saying you don't have free speech. Guys, I'm a journalist. I spent 20 years running CNN's bureaus in Southeast Asia. I am an advocate of free speech, but I know what happens when these tools are used, and I know it firsthand. This is not a free speech issue. This is an amplification issue. So these gatekeepers have got to do the gatekeeping role.
I think one missing link is also when we start talking about algorithms, the way that you're getting things. We have no transparency. Like, we don't know the
Right.
Facebook algorithms, how they work, how YouTube stuff works. If we want to have freedom of speech, we need to know the basis of the decisions that are made for us. So I think that we make sure that you publish those, Facebook, so that we know how you come up with your data.
I mean, this is something I've called the transparency paradox. So we're simultaneously putting tremendous pressure on these platforms to be transparent and open about how everything works, but we're also putting tons of pressure on them to be more secure and locked down with our data than ever before. And it's exactly that pressure to be more secure that prevents people like me from getting data to study, to then publish for the world to see. It has created a chilling effect on research with regard to Facebook. In terms of optimism, I think, again, there's no silver bullet. In the book, I describe that the solution is a combination of money, code, norms, and laws. Money, we have to really think about the incentives that the platforms have to make the policies that they make and how we can engineer those incentives to create better outcomes. Code, obviously technology is neutral, but it's coded in a way that steers it in different directions. So how the algorithms are written is very important. Norms, obviously, society and the way we use technology in different cultures and in different spheres of politics versus culture and so on, matters a great deal. What we accept, you're just talking about your friends and family, what we accept that we see online. And then obviously laws. So I'm a big supporter of generalized data protection laws. But at the same time, we have to understand that we have to balance those laws because, for instance, if you look at the implications of GDPR, it's creating a lot of unintended consequences that are very nuanced. For instance, it's stifling scientific research because people can't share data about individuals. It's stifling, in Romania, it's actually being used to stifle the freedom of press because you can't whistleblow because I have to publish a politician's private data in order to whistleblow and so on. So you have to be very nuanced when you think about the law in particular, I think.
But I would quote Roger McNamee Zucked. He's basically advocating a very strong look. The social media platforms have swerved so far over that if they were to actually be able to give us a chance to survive, something very basic, the laws in the real world, they're there. I can't go and shoot someone in the real world. I can't go and lie and say something libelous or slanderous about you. And yet, in the virtual world, I'm allowed to do that. Why? If you just take the laws in the real world and mirror them in the virtual world, I know that sounds easier than it is, but it's possible.
As a technologist, I find this fascinating because we even in my court case in Sweden 10, 15 years ago, almost, the prosecution and the government were always talking about IRL as something different, and I refused to let them use in real life as a term. I would say away from keyboard, because the internet and the real world is exactly the same. Right. And all technologists know this since 20, 30 years ago, but somehow most of the users and everyone else have this idea that it's a separate space. And I think that's really, really dangerous, because we have to realize we have responsibilities and we have rights both online and offline, and they should be the same. I totally agree.
But laws are regional and they can be oppressive. Isn't there another very naive, optimistic question? I mean, mankind tackled certain technologies and reined them in, whatever, cars, ships. We don't build refrigerators anymore that burn holes in the ozone layer. Isn't there a possibility that the digital realm could develop standards?
I mean, I think speech is a much more tricky subject than faulty car brakes, because there are a lot of different perspectives about what is harmful speech and what isn't harmful speech.
Speech and data, right? So David Kay said in his book, instead of content moderation to the granular level where you talk about having naked people and you get an iconic photo from the Vietnam War taken off Facebook, you use the UN Declaration of Human Rights. It is time to move from granular tech language to values and principles, right? That's first. And then I think the second one is data. Shoshana Zuboff wrote a 750-page book. It just shows you that it's exactly what the tech people say. If our data is the way it's been used now, you can compare it, and I'll quote one last guy, Jim Balsillie. He's the co-founder of BlackBerry. He said, data is not the new oil, it is plutonium. The way we've created our information ecosystem is dangerous for all of us. It is killing all of us. And so we must attack this problem with the same kind of tenacity that we did post-World War II.
This is a very somber final sentiment. We're out of time, but I think it makes a very valid point. So thank you very much, Peter, Maria, and Sinan. I wish we could come back every year and continue this conversation because I think it's very urgent.
Thank you.
I'll come.
Thank you very much.